I am Denise, and I am the Zoom assistant for Christine Caldwell today for the biology and psychology of boundaries and resilience. Christine is a PhD and a licensed professional counselor and a VC dance movement therapist. She's the founder of and professor emeritus at the somatic counseling program of Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado. And I think that's where she's coming from today.
Mhm.
She lectures and trains internationally and has authored 4 books: Getting Our Bodies Back, Getting in Touch, The Body and Oppression, and Bodyfulness. She offers trainings in somatic psychology with specializations in addictions, play behavior, movement sequencing, therapist training, scientific inquiry, and bodily authority. Let's welcome her today.
Well, hello, everyone. Very glad to be here. It's good to see a few little frames of faces, and welcome to all of you. And let's just jump in because there's so much to play with, and I want to make sure I don't get too wordy because this could be a wordy topic. So I'm going to stop a couple of times during the presentation and ask for comments and questions, or potentially do little experiential exercises as well. So if you could, as we go along, if comments or questions occur to you, go ahead and put them in the chat. And Denise will, when I pause, Denise will read those out and we'll sort of take them as a group and then come back to the presentation. And I'm hoping to have some time at the end also for comments and questions. I want to apologize in advance. I'm getting over bronchitis, and so I'm still coughing, but I'm so much better. So I'm just hacking a little bit. So okay, well, let's get moving and begin. So I want to start out with saying who, it's funny, it sort of changes online, right? But I like to, and many of my colleagues like to start a presentation with saying whose land I am on. And I am in Colorado, and therefore I am on Ute land, Cheyenne land, and Arapaho tribes are traditionally and historically, this is their land. So I wanted to make us all aware of that. You might want to take a moment to see where in the world the land that you're sitting on is, in a sense, drenched in the stories of all the ancestors that have lived on that land. And I really like being able to appreciate that as we sort of extend into our conversations about important topics. So just also to talk about my identity locations. I'm white, middle class, cisgender, female. I'm older. I'm kind of larger bodied. I'm bisexual and reasonably fit and able-bodied. I'm a long time, both academic and clinician. I've had sort of one foot in academia and one foot in clinical work for really my whole career. And you'll sort of see that as we go forward. You can see that way of working with my identity there. And I'm also have one foot in the field of body psychotherapy and one foot in the field of dance therapy, feeling that they actually have more in common than we realize. I'm also the author of 4 books. Denise talked about that, so I won't go into it. So I like to start, as a good academic, I like to start with definitions. And so I want to talk about boundaries first. And so here's some definitions of boundaries that I got just out of various dictionaries. So a boundary is a line that marks a limit of an area. So a boundary has a lot of spatial connotations, and we'll look at that in terms of the body, particularly that kind of spatial orientation of boundaries. But it's also a limit of a subject or sphere of activity. And it's sometimes also called a frontier, which I think is actually really cool, that when we're at a boundary, we're also at a frontier, which can be very interesting to contemplate. So there's different types of boundaries. We'll be talking about these different types of boundaries today. So there's obviously physical boundaries, which is a lot about the body, of course. Emotional boundaries, particularly in different cultures, you'll see different boundaries set about emotional expression. So in some cultures, emotion is sort of centralized as being expressed freely, and it doesn't matter. Everyone just has to deal with you expressing. And then in other cultures, there's a sense of privacy to emotions, a sense of holding emotions in because they're communicable, they're catching. And it's rude of you to impose your emotionality on someone else. And so you create a boundary with your emotions. So again, has a very cultural context there. Of course, mental boundaries and social boundaries. And I'm going to talk quite a bit today about social boundaries. I would say I'm going to look mostly at social and physical boundaries today because there's just not enough time to do it all. So what I'd like to suggest, though, is that all boundaries are based in the authority of the body. And that's what we're going to look at from this perspective or through this lens today. That what I'm calling the authority of the body is that it's a kind of human right, as far as I'm concerned, that I have authority over my own body, that I know my body best, that yes, there may be experts out there like doctors and other people that know about bodies in general, but I know about my body, and I take a stand for my body and the integrity of my body and the ability to take a stand for my experience in the world. And this becomes very important when we look at issues of inclusivity in social settings. So that's a concept that we want to really start out with and play with, because there are, on that, again, that social level of boundaries, there's a lot going on that can erode or suppress bodily authority. In other words, there are forces, social forces, that can really encourage us or even push us to erode boundaries and become colonized and victimized by different social forces. So this just gives us a kind of visual of that. There's also levels of boundaries. And so we can see that there's a kind of individual boundary. I tend to, like, through the day, I'll create different boundaries for myself. I'm not going to eat this right now because I'm, even though I kind of crave it, I think I'm going to not eat that today or whatever. But also just individual boundaries about my energy level, my activities, etc. So that's individual. It's also, of course, families are famous for their complexities of boundaries, and who has what boundaries and how are they exercised, and who has control or power about boundaries. And then we have friends, groups, and of course systems. So just being aware again of that boundaries there's not only types of boundaries but levels of boundaries. And so now what I want to do is I have a specialization in neuroscience as an academic. And so I'm not going to get heavily into neuroscience, but I really would like to bring in a few of of how we understand boundaries from a biological as well as a psychological perspective, because to my mind, biology sort of underlies and forms the ground of psychology. In other words, our physicality, our embodiment is what supports and develops and grows our psychology and mental processes. And so if we look at boundary from a biological perspective, now we're looking at all kinds of different organisms. How do organisms, not just humans, form boundaries and maintain boundaries and work with boundaries on a social level? And so what we know from a biological standpoint is that setting a boundary or setting a limit, saying, no, I don't want to do this right now, or I would appreciate it if you would lower your voice. I don't want to be yelled at, or whatever boundary you're setting is usually done both with the gestural, postural body and the spatial body, but it's also typically done with words, not necessarily done with words. So we want to appreciate how the body, how we sit and stand and gesture and all of that, and use space is part of how we use boundaries. Now, setting a boundary is actually less physiologically costly than having to defend yourself. And so what I'd like to set up is this idea that I set a boundary, which is costly, or it costs me, but it's low cost. But I do it, and that takes care of a certain percentage, maybe even a really large percentage of my interactions in life. And I only rarely have to go to the more expensive, physiologically expensive process of defending myself on rare occasions. And so boundaries are something that you do in order to conserve energy so that you don't have to go to defense mechanisms on a ongoing basis, which are physiologically, psychologically, socially very expensive. And I'll talk about that more as we go along. So we want boundaries is something that we do so that we don't have to go default to that defense strategies. And of course, we see that in instances of oppression or instances of trauma, that boundaries are crossed, and then defenses are activated, and then that gets very costly, and the cost to your physical, mental, emotional, social being starts eroding your health and eroding your well-being if you overuse defenses. And so a lot of what I get interested in is how we can get better at boundary setting so that we don't have to go as frequently to defense processes. So again, we also, as we go forward, we want to appreciate that we don't want to expect people to have the same boundaries as we do, or be in the same boundary culture. As I was saying, different cultures have different senses of how, in a sense, how individual an individual is, or how collective an individual is. Cultures kind of have this continuum from highly individualistic to highly collective. And in individualistic cultures, we have a lot more boundary setting and defending. And then in communal cultures, more communal cultures, we have oftentimes a less sense of personal boundaries, individual boundaries. And the boundary might be set more at the family level or at the community level, things like that. So we want to just, again, I really appreciate the richness of boundary culture, what I would call boundary culture. And so when you're relating to someone, particularly someone you don't know well, part of what you want to do is not just default into your own boundary culture and impose your boundary culture, but to really talk it out and see how you can work together cooperatively in the boundary cultures that you're comfortable with and working with. So let me talk about when we have to go to defensiveness, and I'll do a couple of slides, and then I want to hear what you're thinking. It looks like we already have some good numbers of chats in there. So from the level of the body, we have 4 basic defense mechanisms. And this is a kind of, this is a way that actually biology is the one to weigh in here. So particularly we look at it from a cross species perspective. So we look at a lot of different organisms to understand how defense, the defense of bodily authority or bodily integrity occurs across a lot of different species. So this is a biological one. I'm going to do Stephen Porges, who you might already know, in a minute. And he is a little bit more psychological in his approach. So here's our biological one. So the first defense, these are called, by the way, the 4 Fs. So, and be aware that there's still a little bit of controversy about these 4 Fs. You see them categorized differently by different theoreticians and clinicians. These are my favorites because I feel like they line up with biological processes really well. So a fight process is something usually that a more mature organism does. So for instance, babies will tend not to have enough muscle tone and body coordination to fight well. So they use different defenses, and I'll talk about that in a sec. But fight, in order to fight, we have to activate the sympathetic nervous system. And of course, the sympathetic nervous system is an arousal nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system primes you with things like adrenaline and cortisol and things like that, that mobilize energy for you to defend yourself by fighting. Fighting has a tendency to send blood and oxygen to the upper body in most species, into the face and the neck and things like that. This is why we'll say something like, she was so angry, she was red in the face. And it's because your face actually literally does get redder because there's more blood up in your upper body so that you can bite, so that you can hit or grab or punch or whatever. So there's this more upper body organization, and it's a mobilization of the sympathetic nervous system, which is metabolically expensive. Okay. So then we have flight. That's getting out of there, running away. And we, of course, see a lot of organisms do that, particularly ones that are older, more coordinated, more muscle toned. You don't see it as much in children or young organisms. But flight is also in the sympathetic nervous system. So it also really it gives you resources like adrenaline and cortisol and some other norepinephrine, things like that, to run. And so what happens a lot in flight is that a lot of your blood and oxygen go to the lower body. And of course, the lower body, you want all that good blood and oxygen there in order to run, right? And so that's why we'll say she was scared and her face just got really white because, you know, white as a sheet or white as a ghost. And that's because the blood is actually draining out of the upper body more and going into the lower body to prime it for running. Again, it needs more oxygen. It needs more glucose to go into the muscles, and both of these, fight and flight, need that. And so the sympathetic nervous system kicks in and borrows energy from other systems in the body to divert all these resources for defense. So what happens is in this diversion, you know, this sort of borrowing energy from other parts of the body, is the parts of the body that get diverted from, literally kind of shut down certain systems of the body, because if you can't deal with that bear in the woods, if you don't survive that, you don't need anything else, right? So you borrow from other systems, and the systems that you borrow from are the immune system, right? You don't need it right now. And so it turns down the immune system, makes you more immunovulnerable. I remember there was interesting research done that shows people have a tendency to get colds, viral colds, about 2 to 3 days after they've had a really stressful interaction, particularly with someone that they love or care about. So like a fight with someone, you're much more likely to get a cold afterward because of the stress of the fight. You have to mobilize, turn off the immune system so that you mobilize the defenses. Also, the reproductive system. This is why a lot of times people under a lot of stress have trouble with fertility. So immune, reproductive, and digestive. Digestive is the other one. So the stress of defending yourself messes with your digestion. I think we all know that and have experience with that, whether it's sort of the more upper parts of the digestive system or the lower. And so again, it's more expensive and you want to only do it rarely. And so it's another argument for really setting good boundaries. Now, the third one, and here's where we start to get a little bit controversial, freeze is the way I define freezing, which is a little bit different than other people, so just be aware, is that you're contracting both a muscle for an action and the muscle for the opposite action at the same time. So my hand flexes and extends. And what happens in freezing is I both flex and extend at the same time. And so what's happening is I'm really ramped up. I'm really tense, but I'm tense as a way to hold still. And this is oftentimes what young children will do or young animals will do, is they'll freeze because the predator that's after them is hunting through vision. And so it looks for movement. It looks for movement in the environment. And so if you hold still, maybe you won't be seen and maybe you won't be predated against. And so that's also uses a lot more oxygen. It uses a lot of the stress hormones and it's very expensive. The last one is called faint. And this is parasympathetically dominant. So parasympathetic is the quote rest and digest division of the nervous system. And that means everything tones down. There's a lot of relaxation. We have to get parasympathetic to fall asleep or to just relax and rest. We have to get more parasympathetic to digest properly, to be fertile, and to have a good, robust immune system. This does not need oxygen particularly. In fact, your oxygen load can afford to go down quite a bit. So I'll go one more slide and then I'd like to hear from you what you think. So now I'd like to go to Stephen Porges, who's very famous for his sense of how to look at defenses and boundaries. So he does it from a biological perspective. And he says, okay, we've got this really important nerve complex in our body called the vagal nerve. And the vagal nerves have 3 divisions, an upper, a middle, and a lower. And so the upper vagal innervates the neck, the jaw, the eyes, the ears, the mouth, the face. And so a lot of the vagal nerve actually is involved in thinking things like speaking, the look on your face, how you're breathing, but particularly speaking. And so this is kind of the division of the nervous system that helps you talk things out or set a boundary, for instance, by saying what you want, what you feel and what you want. And so this is the least expensive. It's called the social engagement system. In other words, you're staying engaged with the person. You're staying in contact with them as a way to navigate boundaries. And it's, of course, very complex. You have to learn it. You have to practice it a lot. A lot of people are not good at it. They're not, and so a lot of what we think of as happening in therapy is trying to help people come from the more trauma and oppression-based divisions of the vagal nerve up into the social engagement, which is less expensive and more able to set boundaries rather than sort of devolve into defenses. And so now in this middle vagal area, we have the defense. Actually, we have our fight flight, the sympathetic nervous system. And so again, this is where my heart rate increases, my breathing increases, and where a lot of my stress hormones go is in this middle chest area and the organs in the chest, particularly the heart and the lungs. And so this is where it gets more expensive and it gets more costly. Now, the level 3 is called immobility, and this is where, again, I put freeze and faint because that's what Porges does. I think freezing is actually more in level 2, but he's talking about it. I think he's making an important point that both freezing and fainting are a kind of immobility. They're kind of going still as a way to defend, whereas the other two are doing something, right, to set a boundary or defend yourself. And so in immobility, particularly in the DVS, the dorsal vagal, which is associated with the lower belly, the intestines, the lower digestive tract, it's called the dorsal vagal system, and it just turns you off. You basically go away. Some people call that dissociation, but actually you can dissociate during fighting and flight as well, where you don't know how you got there, or you didn't realize you hit someone, or a lot of people who particularly have impulse control problems and are abusive will say that while they're, let's say, hitting someone, they don't even remember doing it or realize they're doing it at the time. So there's a kind of dissociative process in all three. But a lot of people will stress how dissociative this third one, the dorsal vagal, is. It's really about just on a, a mild level, it's like your attention goes away and you just go, huh? What'd you say? You're just kind of spacing out. That's a low level DVC response, not particularly expensive, but a really expensive one is literally losing consciousness. And so that's how we can understand that more from, again, still really going from the body perspective, but looking at it in a bit of a more psychological way. So I'll talk about this in a minute, but right now let's check in. And Denise, can you tell me about the chat and just give me some of the chat questions and comments?
There is one question here. When appropriate, so what happens to the body when it's been in a prolonged state of freeze? And what would be a few tools that one could use to exercise leaving the state, say as a result of burnout, PTSD, or both? That's
right. Yeah, great question. And we will get to that. The probably the whole second half, or even second 2/3 of the presentation is about what we're going to do. So thanks. Yeah, we'll be getting there.
Okay. And Keely is curious about numbing and dissociation related to chronic pain.
Yeah. This is, it's really interesting because there's a good body of research that talks about the upside of dissociation. And this is really important. Dissociation is not necessarily a bad phenomenon, or you could say that dissociation is your best option. And so really working with pain in a way that you can alternate between really staying present to it and investigating it and getting curious about it and noticing the details of it and sort of inhabiting it in a way that helps you to understand what it's wanting or what it's saying, right? The kind of what I call a body narrative is really important. However, what's also important is to be able to try to have skills to take a break from it. And so there's a whole issue about things like distraction and things like being able to turn your attention away from some part of you that's in pain and be able to put it into, let's say, a different part of your body that isn't in pain and say, that's me too. This part of my body isn't in pain. And if I put my attention there, I have a more balanced experience. Yes, I have a headache, but I also notice that my legs feel really fine, right? Something like that. Or reading a book when you're sick or watching television when you're sick. It's a way to like not kind of spiral into the pathos of being sick. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think particularly what we want to appreciate is how we can do that consciously. How can we can do it conscientiously? How can we do it as a strategy that is going to support our well-being when it is paired with also being able to, as I was talking about, investigate the pain, say, this is me feeling this pain. What is this pain saying? What do I need to learn here? What do I need to particularly do differently to help myself through this pain experience?
Mhm.
So that's, I could go on. That's a really cool area of inquiry. Thanks for asking that.
Ken has a question about what happens to a person in the body who's been abandoned for several weeks.
I'm sorry, a person who has been abandoned for several weeks?
Mhm.
An adult or a
Uh,
child? I'm not sure.
he
Uh,
hasn't clarified that.
uh-huh.
He's asking about a child, yes.
Okay, a child. Yeah. Abandonment and neglect have been shown in research to be, in many cases, actually more detrimental biologically and psychologically than trauma is. Uh, Abandonment and neglect is so antithetical to us as a social mammal that when it happens in a child, it's actually quite powerful and profound. Not to say that it can't be worked with in most cases and repaired in most cases, but it's a tough one. It can be a really tough one. And I'll stop there for now. We can maybe talk about it later after we go through some of our other stuff. Maybe one more.
Okay. We have someone's wondering about spinal cord injuries and their impact on the vagal nervous system, where it's
Yeah.
located and how it can be physically disrupted.
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, it depends on the level of the spinal paralysis, where in the spine the paralysis begins and ends. But the vagal nerves go directly from the gut up into through the brainstem, and so you have to get really almost C1 or 2 spinal cord injuries to really erode the vagal nerve on a technical level. And of course, on an indirect level, there's a lot going on that there's lessened feedback coming from the body in terms of, let's say, if the spinal injury is higher, you don't get information, you don't get feedback, sensory feedback from that area, and so it can, over time, make that division of the vagal system a little bit less efficient, but it still operates.
Mhm.
Okay, so let's go forward. We can take some more of those questions as we go along. because I want to get to resilience and what we want to do about all this. And so let's see, 10:30, 11:30, 11:45, right, okay. So we want to think of it as a boundary as a kind of continuum. When I have no boundaries, very poor boundaries, I'm fusing with everything. I feel everybody's everything. I take in everybody's everything. I'm too permeable. I really have the cost of that is that I'm always strongly influenced by what's happening around me. And of course, that's really cool in certain situations. Take sexuality. During sexuality, we usually lower our boundaries and enjoy and play in those fusion states. Now, in isolation, we are doing the opposite. We're making really, really strong boundaries. And then what happens is not necessarily things don't get in, like tenderness or affection or the ability to read other people appropriately and respond appropriately, because you're isolating and you're feeling so internal and cut off that you start to not be able to connect in relationship. And so, however, in times it's important to isolate, right? It's important to get away from, let's say, toxic interactions that are happening or dangerous interactions. And so we want to see it sort of like a bell curve, where on some occasions we go toward fusion, some occasions we go toward isolation, but we want those to be somewhat rare because we want to spend most of our time in that middle zone, which is in biology, we would call it having a permeable membrane. In other words, there's a boundary there, but it's permeable. And that's where contact happens. That's where relationship happens. That's where there's really, again, this ability to exchange safely. And so that's kind of our boundary continuum and where we want to play in terms of our skills. We want to be able to defend ourselves with, and we want to be able to let go of our boundaries and change them and let them shift. And we can think about it along this continuum. So I want to talk about social maintenance of boundary dysfunction, where we see that different oppressive systems can really contribute to not being able to form good boundaries and not being able to even defend yourself well. And so this is where we see what's called body as project. And so my body is always an improvement project. I'm always, getting, I'm always on a diet. I'm always going to the gym. I'm really into how I look, or that I need to be athletic, or that I need to dress a certain way, or I need to have cosmetic surgery or whatever. And so the body's never okay. It's never enough. It's never just itself. It's always an improvement project. And this can lead us to have poor boundaries. And it's a socially maintained system that, Ralph Lauren and Christian Dior and all those people want you to buy all their stuff because you are using your body as a project. Also, body is commodity. And so that means that you are seen and trained to be a consumer, and you are trained to feel like you need to buy this in order to feel okay. And you are also trained to be a good worker, like you're trained to not listen to your body so that you can be on a factory floor for all day for years and years and years. And so this is where you get that kind of worker bee kind of thing, that we want to train people for assembly lines. The really classic one right now is if you look at what people have to do in Amazon fulfillment centers. It's sort of scary what they are being required to do on their shifts. So that's the body as a commodity where, they're not only being allowed to take pee breaks at certain hours, and there's no lunch, there's no exercise, there's just this body as worker thing. So body shaming and othering, so making certain bodies wrong for deviating from an agreed upon norm, which is that norm is usually established by those in power. So people in power not only get to do all kinds of other cool stuff, but they get to define what the right body is. So the obvious things like skin color, to size, to age, to all ability, all these things will create a kind of body shaming that messes with your bodily authority and your boundaries. Also what, oh gosh, in the 70s, a guy named Thomas Hanna coined the term sensory motor amnesia. I love this term. So in other words, we get trained not to pay attention to our body. In fact, there was a really interesting research project done that said that people have a tendency to only pay attention to their body during 3 conditions, and that's sex, pain, and exercise. And so we realized that a lot of cultures, particularly developed cultures, are really not invested in you having an embodied life. And that works for that system quite well, because then it erodes your bodily authority, and you're not going to read that you're being oppressed or you're being manipulated and controlled. And of course, this results in what we call body colonization, so that the oppressive systems are literally colonize your body so that your body's not your own. And your body is, in a sense, a kind of a possession of the system that you're in. And we also will call that domestication. So literally, the body becomes almost like a domesticated animal, where you're by the way, there's, I think, 3 definitions of a domesticated animal. A domesticated animal is when you control their reproduction, when you control their food and feeding behavior, and when you control their freedom of movement. Does that sound like any political forces that are happening right now in this country, in the US, those of us who are in the US and perhaps in other countries? So we see this domestication, particularly right now in the States. We're very alert about this, of the domestication of women, as Roe v. Wade has been overturned. So treating the body like a domesticated animal is part of what we see about boundary dysfunction. And so here, let's start to talk about what do we do about this. And so here's our project. Here's our, in a sense, individual activism, our family activism, and our social systems activism. So to have, this is again, just a list of my recommendations. We want to have practices that we do regularly that help us to really inhabit our bodily authority. And so that has to be sensing practices. In other words, really checking in with the different senses to really be with the body as it is experiencing itself in the present moment. And also feeling practices. So not only what I'm sensing, let's say that my throat is tight, but that I also inquire into how am I feeling, and which is a more generalized idea. I'm feeling depressed, I'm feeling excited, I'm feeling nauseous, I'm feeling scared. And we start to get into emotional processing. Knowing how you feel is one of the most important resistance moves you can make in an oppressive system. Whether that oppression is in a family system or a community system or a large global system. Also, I really feel it's very important to engage in breathing practices, conscious breathing, because, and I can't go into it, we don't have enough time for me to go into it, but breathing is probably one of our most accessible and critical functions for self-regulation. So if I can really support both my inhale and my exhale, do that consciously, not necessarily big, hefty breathing or fast breathing or deep breathing, but just really supporting that my breathing matches my state, and that I'm working with my breathing, and I can breathe consciously as a way to train myself. This is one of our most important ways of working with boundaries and resilience. But also moving, expressing practices, that it's not enough just to know what you feel or to sense yourself. You actually have to do something about it. And there's where there's this sense of individual activism. Now they're saying sitting is the new smoking, right? And they say you shouldn't sit for more than an hour, get up and move around, walk after dinner. I mean, I could, dozens and dozens of research, huge research projects are showing how important it is to move and stay mobile. But this is also a psychological and a social phenomenon, as well as a physical health phenomenon. It relieves depression, for instance, much better than medication. If it's mild to moderate depression, exercising and moving around a lot is actually better than antidepressants. It's a different story for major depression, by the way, severe depression. But so breathing and moving and sensing are actually really your best self-care ever. And so this is what I want to start helping us to really get a sense of, is breathing, moving, sensing is our sort of golden triangle in a sense. So also I'm going to borrow a phrase from the philosopher Elizabeth Benke, who I totally am in love with. And she calls it inhabiting the body from within. And so when something happens, I really sit with that and be with that and say, this is me breathing in this way. This is me aroused in this particular way. I am holding and being with this. I'm not trying to get rid of it. I'm not trying to exaggerate it. I'm just inhabiting it from within. This is me. This is me. And I try to be with it on a very powerful level without judging it, saying it's wrong or right, and just being very curious about my ongoing experiential state. And so I have a whole spiel that I could do maybe another time about how this promotes what I call grace and gracefulness. I think grace, we talk about people being physically graceful, but it is, I think, also a mental, psychological, emotional idea too. And I think grace comes from this inhabiting the body within, this, again, this golden triangle of breathing, moving, and sensing. And so also when we're in relationships, whether that's large ones or smaller ones, more intimate ones, we have to really work on reclaiming our bodily authority, that I make sure I have bodily authority in relationships. And so part of that then would be to resist social toxins like consumerism and body shaming. This is particularly important in teenage culture, where there's an epidemic of online shaming and bullying going on, as well as consumerism. What I call somatic affirmative action, being an ally for the different body, being an ally for bodies that don't conform particularly to standardized norms. And whether it's a large body or a small body or a older body or a body that's shaped differently than what we might call the norm. This goes into disability theory as well as what we usually think. So celebrating the physicality of our relationships, even when we're online, but really realizing that I'm in a physical relationship with my friend, with my lover, with my family, that feeling the body to body connection directly is part of what we do to reclaim our bodily authority. And also, I'm a big fan of moving together, whether that's dancing or singing or just doing things together. If we look at the research on aging, healthy aging, yeah, a lot of what they're finding is that older people who get to these really, like 100 and 110, these little pockets of mega aging, they're sitting around together and they're talking, they're dancing, in Argentina they're tangoing together, things like this. And so moving together is a really important aspect of what we want to do. So now I'm going to switch over to resilience, but let's take a few more comments and questions before I do that. So Denise, what have we got here? You want to go down the list a little bit more?
Just a quick question first. What was the name of the philosopher you just mentioned? One or two people wanted to know.
Great. Elizabeth Behnke, Behnke, Behnke. I believe she's American, but I'm not sure, North American. And she's what's called a phenomenologist, and she writes some really accessible stuff. So I think she's worth investigating.
Okay, so going back to some of the questions even before the last one, there's a question about baby in the third trimester experiences trauma while stuck in parasympathetic. This person is wondering how much that's contributed to her own struggles with fainting and also with freeze and mobility dissociation. She says it's rare for her to ramp up to fight or flight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a great self-reflection. And certainly there's probably not enough research done in the prenatal area. A lot of the ideas about prenatal psychology are pretty poor in terms of scientific validation. So you have to be really careful in this area. But increasingly, we're seeing that a strong sense of what's called imprinting starts to occur in the third trimester. So the ability to sort of create what are called biological set points. In other words, a kind of a limit to the possible range of human behaviors. You start to listen to your environment, your intrauterine environment or your external environment once you're born, and create these kind of physiological set points. So for instance, a small infant will be held by its caregiver, and they're being held on the chest of the caregiver, and literally their body is listening to your body. Their heartbeat is actually listening to your heartbeat for how fast to beat in the world. Or they're also listening to your breathing, and they're listening and they're patterning their own body on how shallow or deep your breath is, how frequent your breath is. And so there's a lot of imprinting going on, particularly in late pregnancy, is better researched, and the early years of creating these biological set points. I think, of course, the earlier something traumatic happens, the more energy you have to put in to redo those set points. And in some cases, they're probably so strongly compromised that you'll never have the set point that might work more optimally for you. For instance, in cases of like fetal alcohol syndrome, has oftentimes real lasting consequences that just can't be completely overcome. So, but the good news is all the things we're going to talk about are really important for redoing your biological set points. And so, for instance, breathing, particularly breathing that emphasizes the inhale, because the inhale is actually more sympathetically dominant. And so, you might be a good candidate for sort of what's called charged breathing, or sort of bigger inhaling kind of breath work. And very judiciously and step by step, small step by small step, doing things that activate your sympathetic nervous system. Getting excited about something, just finding what you can really regulate in terms of challenging your sympathetic nervous system to get more toned. Okay, resilience. Here's my definitional page, being the capacity to recover quickly, being sturdy. I talk to my students all the time about when you sign up to be a therapist, you sign up to be sturdy. And the capacity of an object to spring back into shape. I like that definition too. So there's different types of resilience, and let's go for there. We can also see a kind of top down and bottom up resilient skills. So top down is sort of starting with thinking your way, sort of talking yourself out of something in a sense, or talking yourself into something, saying, this is what I want, this is my intention. I'm going to kind of work with that and really top down play with my embodied experience. Now, bottom up is direct experience. I'm going to listen to my body. I'm going to take my bodily authority as a kind of a guide post for me. And what I'd like to suggest is that we need both of those. We need skills in both. We don't want to just try and talk ourselves into and out of things. And we want to really make sure that we have a lot of physical practices that are from the bottom up, that are from our direct experience, holding and caring for our direct experience. Here's what I call bodyfulness. And so this is our golden triangle. And this is what also develops resilience. And this is, again, another way to talk about it. And so we want to really have conscious, dedicated practices that are both embedded in our day and also specialized parts of our day that use that golden triangle. And particularly that we have conscious and deliberate moving, that we really activate our moving in the world as a sense of our bodily authority. As we move, we accomplish things, we do things. When you're thirsty, you reach for the water. And that reaching actually creates a sense of bodily authority. I can do this. And that's a lot of different kinds of bodies. The body that you have has bodily authority. And of course, I talked about moving together. A word that's being used a lot in philosophy is called intercorporeality. Also, again, we see that I would say that there's 4 main ways of looking at both boundaries and resilience in terms of our ability to work with them. Training your attention, being able to land your attention on something and then deliberately take it away and put it somewhere else. This is actually quite foundational to any kind of well-being, and is trained very directly through meditation practice, but it also can be just a standalone practice. I do this a lot with my students. I do what's called the oscillation of attention. I have them oscillate out, really look at the outside world and sense it in detail, and then oscillate in. Balanced out and in is where we optimize our well-being and where we optimize boundary setting, because we're not falling into the environment, only taking our cues from the environment and neglecting ourselves. And we're not also so self-absorbed that we're not reading the environment. And so by oscillating back and forth, we create a lovely boundary and a lovely balance that creates resilience. And also this idea of inhabiting our experience or owning our experience. So really looking at the clenching in my throat and saying, this is me doing this. It's not something that is happening to me. It's me doing this. I'm actually clenching my throat. And it's not by inhabiting it or taking ownership of that, we then have more control over it. By disowning it, we then also remove our ability to work with it. We say, that's not me. Someone else did this to me. And so by taking ownership of my direct experience, I have the ability then to work with it. And also appreciating multiple experiences, that my body's always generating experiences and they have a lot of range to them, and beginning to appreciate the range of my experiences, and that I can be angry and sad, and I can have pleasure and pain and all of these particularly levels of energy, and appreciating that they're all there and they're all me, and that I care for all of those. I don't try to suppress or repress different states. I don't choose which ones are okay to feel and which ones aren't. And so that ability, again, to inhabit one's present state very conscientiously and without judgment. And also taking action, really being able to move with what I feel and what I want, to be able to take a stand for something, to be able to take action in the face of something. Being able to act is one of the finest ways that we recover from things like trauma or neglect. And so this is why I actually specialize in, being what I call a movement therapist. I think movement is actually really a kind of prime directive. This idea that I really create this sense of my body, my moving body is kind of telling stories, and I call it body narratives. And so those narratives help me to really experience and use my bodily authority. But also, one of the other things that a lot of research will show is how important creative states and play are for resiliency and boundary setting, but particularly for resiliency, that play should be an integral part of any day that we have. And we see children playing. Children obviously are natural players, and they just fall into it at a moment's notice all the time. It's very cool. A lot of times as adults, we're more deliberate, and we have to really choose it. And we want to see that there's forms of adult play that are not like children's play, and that children aren't ready for yet. So for instance, I see sex as a kind of adult play behavior. And certainly sex is associated with greater levels of well-being. Also creative processes like art making and are an adult form of play that are massively associated with resilience and good boundaries. So I'll go there. A lot of that research has been done on what's called flow states. One thing that they've been, that I thought was really interesting in terms of the brain, was they showed that if you do brain scans of traumatized people, what happens is that certain parts of the brain, like the amygdala and the cingulate gyrus and things like that, are hot. They're real red. They're used a lot, but the space around them is dark. It's not in use. And so trauma is not just that a certain part of the brain gets really hot and overused. That's true. But the other half of the equation is that all these other parts aren't getting used. They're dark. They're not being, the whole brain is not being used. It's only being compartmentalized and partly used. That's trauma. That's a traumatized brain. A creative brain, go figure, is a kind of, the whole brain is in use, and everything's cool, right? There's no hot spots, but there's the whole brain is engaged. And so when you look at the brain imaging of people in creative states, there's this cool, all global use in the brain. So that's where we want to cultivate in terms of using creativity, and what Cheek sent me high called flow states. His book on this is just called Flow. I really recommend it. It's old and still hugely relevant. Okay, and so I also talk about bodily free press, but I'm not going to do that. But I feel like, we talk about free speech and free press, that is here in the States where, a lot of people are really into our Constitution and our constitutional rights. And what I'm here to say is that I feel like there's a right that we have to a bodily free press. And this is the right to move freely, the right to speak one's body language freely and not be unsafe, the right to express emotions and reactions freely and still be safe, the right to one's own body narratives, the stories of my body and my ancestors' bodies. And freely doesn't mean just, all over the place. It doesn't mean dysregulated or, all over the place. It means safely and without hurting oneself or others on purpose. So again, we are looking at taking care not to privilege or marginalize bodies, my own and other people's, particularly through their sensations, their feelings, or their movements. And so these are some of the terms that I use to talk about when we privilege or marginalize bodies in ways that then create a lack of bodily authority for certain groups or certain individuals. And so that's just that slide. And this is some of the benefits, I think, of what I'm calling bodyfulness, these practices. And by now, this list should feel familiar to you. But this is also where research happens in terms of when we do these practices, what kinds of things can come from it. Then this is another way of talking about the 4 basic strategies of bodyfulness. Oh, by the way, I will turn this into a PDF and maybe I can email it to you, Denise, and maybe we can give it out to everybody if anyone would like a PDF of this slide show, since I'm having to run through at the end here. So let's take a few minutes for comments and questions. We have about 5 minutes.
There's so many questions. Let's see. We got to, what do you think about integrating liberation and critical psychology as a way to understand body colonization? That's a big question.
It's a big question, and the basic answer is yes, an emphatic yes. I think liberation theology or liberation psychology are a great place to start.
And body domestication is the control of reproduction, food. And what was the third thing that you said? Someone missed it.
Freedom of movement.
I thought so. Someone would like to understand boundaries versus defensiveness with toxic coworkers, like finding that currency.
I think the idea, whether it's a coworker or a friend or someone you're around regularly, how critical it is to negotiate, not just impose, but negotiate boundaries so that you don't have to feel defensive. And so the idea is you use the upper division of the vagal nerve, the social engagement system, to say, here's what I would like in our relationship. Here's what makes me uncomfortable. Here's where my hard limit is. Tell me about your what you would like in terms of your boundaries in this relationship. And so that's just a basic thing. Unfortunately, I can't go into more detail because of time.
And someone's asking, to speak to the queer trans body and how they're often overlooked.
Another huge area.
Right.
Um, what I would say is that the body that's not identifying in the gender binary for any reason is probably one of the most oppressed and unsafe areas of social activity. And I'm over the years have become appalled at the level of trauma and stress that this causes for, again, non-binary bodies, or I guess in general, we might want to say queer bodies, and bodies that are in transition. I don't know quite what to say, except that I feel that this is an area that's understudied and needs a lot more attention. Uh, Making the body wrong, the different body wrong, is an area that needs a lot more attention.
And there is a question about bibliography, if there's a place to find or access a bibliography that you'd recommend.
Oh, yeah, it looks like I didn't put a bibliography in here. I will try to, oops, I'm not. I will try to send that along with the PDF.
Okay, awesome. And there's a question, can you explain what causes traumatic activation of fight, flight, or freeze when returning to somatic exercises after a re-traumatization, specifically strong urge to run or fight followed by collapse on the yoga mat when engaging practices that have historically been very helpful and allowed connection with the self?
What I would say again, real shortly, is one way to look at this event or series of events is that you're having a body memory. So you find a pose or you have some certain activity, and that activity wakes up the motoric patterns that have been stored in terms of your history. And that's true for anybody, people who have not been traumatized as well, that putting your body into certain activities or postures and gestures wakes up body memories constantly. And so what you want to appreciate there is that I am remembering something. We actually have many different memory systems, and we tend to only focus on what's called declarative memory, the memory for facts and images and historic events and things like that. But there's also body-based forms of memory, and they're what's called implicit. They're not necessarily conscious. And another word for it is procedural memory, the memory of how to do things, like knowing how to ride a bike is a body memory. Your body literally remembers how to do the bike when you get on it. And so that's because it's formed bodily habits toward that object, the bicycle. And so what happens is that whenever we move in a certain way, we wake up these body memories, which is on some level a good thing. It's a good thing because then we can work with it. So I would say just be with it, inhabit it, try not to judge it, don't make it wrong. Stay with it in curiosity and allow yourself to collapse. Allow yourself to go there and really work with what you're noticing there. And you might need to do that with a therapist. You might be able to do that with a friend, or you might be able to do it by yourself, but you'll know best. But you really inquire into it. It's a strategy that is answering a body memory. Looks like we are at the end.
We are out of time.
Yeah, I'm so sorry I wasn't able to get to all the questions and comments. I really appreciate the ones that we were able to get to.
And I hope that they would reach out to you in on all the ways that you're out there in the world through your books and
Uh-huh.
read more of your theories that way. We want to
Yeah.
say thank you so much today, Christine.